who's a Stanford neuroendocrinologist and professor of biology and neurology. He's also spent decades living around different types of primates like baboons and learning a lot from them and studying them. You can watch all of his or a lot of his Stanford lectures on YouTube. Check them out. They're awesome. You can also read his new fascinating book about human behavior called Behave. I highly recommended that. I learned a fuck of a lot about human behavior from that. I'll add the links for I've written a lot of blogs about what I've learned from his work. I'll add those to the description in this video. Anyway, one of the blogs that I've written about his work is about how men are not genetically better at math than women, contrary to what a lot of people have told us. And I thought that before I learned about what Robert Sapolsky has said about this. So basically, scientific studies in socialist Iceland show that the differences get dramatically reduced over only 20 or 30 years. And if there's a different cultural mindset toward math skills between boys and girls, then it vanishes in school. Then it vanishes quickly. And if you know even a little bit about evolution, you know that it works so slowly that a change that big over only 20 or 30 years cannot be due to only evolution. Socialization is a huge factor in this perceived difference, of course. Another one of my blogs about Robert Sapolsky's work is a second fascinating idea that I learned from him. This is that there are people who are born as both male and female who are not hermaphrodites. I'll say that again. There are people who are born as both male and female who are not hermaphrodites. Isn't that fucking bizarre? I thought that was impossible before I learned about it. And sometimes these people change sexes during puberty. So they're born with the male genotype, which means that they're biologically male, but they have the female phenotype, which means they look female. But so they have vaginas, but then sometimes during puberty, they grow fucking penises. Like, I mean, it's hard enough to be a teenager as it is, right? If we're a quote unquote normal teenager. Imagine how much harder it is if you're one of those people and you're born with a vagina and you start growing a fucking penis during puberty. How can anyone deal with that, right? Anyway, the third idea that I learned about from Robert Sapolsky and wrote a blog about gets into the nature versus nurture debate, which everyone knows about, of course. Both nature and nurture are heavily involved with all aspects of human behavior in fluctuating levels, of course. But randomness is a third and often overlooked factor. We often don't consider how random the aspects are that shape our environment, culture, and genetic expression. Like the culture, the genetic expression, and the nature and nurture are often caused by really random factors that are completely outside of our control, and that's important to remember, I think. Anyway, yet another engrossing topic that Sapolsky discusses, elaborates on in his books and lectures is vasopressin, which is a hormone. Like most or maybe even all hormones, vasopressin has a lot of interesting functions and downstream effects, of course, like all hormones. It's virtually a guarantee that there's way more involved with it than what I'm about to tell you about it. But one very interesting finding in scientific studies is that people with naturally higher vasopressin levels tend to have better social relationships. Science focuses on generalities, of course, because it has to, and you can't account for it's basically impossible to account for all relevant factors. But it's probably true that people with deeper and more meaningful relationships with friends and family members have more vasopressin than those with worse social relationships. So the opposite is also generally true. People with bad and distant relationships with their family members and friends are more likely to have lower vasopressin levels. Correlation doesn't equal causation, of course, so this doesn't mean that these are inevitable and this is always the way that things happen. And environmental factors are almost undoubtedly involved in the genetic expression of people with varying degrees of vasopressin. But these are good general tendencies that scientists can use to help them learn more about human behavior, because that's the only way that we can do it with science, as far as I know. An interesting detail about how vasopressin works is that there are different genetic upstream promoters of it. We all have slightly different levels of our hormones, of course. Like, there are not very many men who have exactly the same amount of testosterone as me, and there are not very many women who have exactly the same amount of estrogen. There are a few, but most people have at least slightly different amounts, of course. Anyway, this means that with vasopressin, higher or lower amounts are partially caused by different genes. People with certain genes are more likely to have different vasopressin levels than those of us with different genes. This means that some of your genes might contribute to you having lower or higher vasopressin levels than someone else. Your genes will help lead to this hormone being expressed in different amounts from another person. This doesn't take environmental effects into account either, of course. But these are genetic factors that lead to vasopressin being expressed in higher or lower levels. Other interesting studies examine monogamy and polygamy in voles. As far as I know, these haven't yet been replicated in humans. However, the vole experiments found that those with higher vasopressin levels were more likely to be polygamous than monogamous. Voles with lower amounts of vasopressin tended to be monogamous rather than polygamous. Humans are obviously genetically different from voles, but we have very similar genes to them. We even have very similar genes to trees, right? Like, a lot of living organisms have very similar genetic structures, or genetic makeups, I should say. So if we are like voles in this way, that means that if we have an easier time with being committed to one sexual partner, we're likely to have less vasopressin than someone with more difficulty who prefers having multiple sexual partners. If you prefer having multiple sexual partners and have trouble with committing to being monogamous, this might be partially because you have more vasopressin than serial monogamous. This isn't an excuse, of course. It's just a likely explanation. It's not like if you go around cheating, you can just say, "Oh, I just have more vasopressin." And if you're monogamous, you can just say, "Oh, I just have less vasopressin." No, it's not the way that is. Obviously, environmental factors take into account, and we should all take responsibility for our actions and everything like that, of course. These are also generalizations that don't take into account environmental factors, like I just said, but they're useful speculations, like all of science, for helping endocrinologists figure out why we behave the way we do. Other scientific studies found that different amounts of vasopressin influence our abilities to read facial expressions. Since more vasopressin can help you have better social relationships, you can probably guess how this works, given everything I just said, right? Do you think that more or less of vasopressin gives you more difficulty with analyzing how someone feels? I'll give you a second to think about that. Do you figure it out yet? Good job. You're right. If you have an easy time with reading facial expressions, you're more likely to have greater levels of vasopressin. So if you have more difficulty with reading facial expressions, it's probably partially because you have less vasopressin. The genetic reasons that some of us have a harder time with analyzing how other people feel when we talk to them is that we likely have less vasopressin than some other people. Different cultures and environments also have a large impact on our genetic expression of this hormone, of course. Like, different cultures will impact the genetic expression of it differently, and different individual environments and upbringings. Varying amounts of vasopressin also affect whether we get autism. This is just one factor, of course. There isn't one cause of autism. It's a lot more complicated than that, and environment and culture pretty much always play a role. But since fluctuating levels of this hormone influence our social behavior, it makes sense that it's a relevant factor for autism. You've probably already guessed, given what I've just told you, that lower vasopressin levels can help lead to autism. Like with all other genetic tendencies, that doesn't mean that this is written in stone and everyone with less vasopressin automatically gets autism, of course. But generally, you're less likely to get autism if you have more vasopressin than someone with less of it. Unless your environment and culture change your genetic expression enough, which does happen a lot, of course, you probably won't get autism if you have very high levels of vasopressin. All right, so that's some of what I've learned about vasopressin from Robert Sapolsky. I hope that you're as fascinated by his knowledge of the complexities of human behavior as me. This hormone is just one small piece of that phenomenally complicated puzzle. I'm just barely scratching the surface of how it works and what it does, and I'm not a scientist, of course. So don't take my word as gospel and as if I know the objective truth about these things. But you don't have to be a scientist to enjoy learning, right? Learning is awesome. Everyone should do it. Thanks so much to everyone who's already my patron on Patreon, and thank you so much to anyone else who also becomes my patron. I appreciate the fuck out of it. You have no idea how much I would appreciate that. Alright, so keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the impenetrable darkness in the world. I love you all, and adios until next time.